And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. I've just finished my Victoria 3 tutorial, so a sort of proof that I understand the basic mechanics of the game before this review. And so this will now be a review of Victoria 3 and the things that I like and dislike about it. So I've got about 17 hours into the game now. I'm by no means a metagame expert. I've played as Sweden, learnt some of the mistakes and the bad habits I brought over from Victoria 2, and then eventually went and played Russia, which are very two different game play styles and very two different sort of governments. This sort of review will cover warfare, the economy, politics, and population, as well as the UI, and generally what I think about the game. If you want to do a too long didn't read, if you just want to hear the basics, it's a good baseline for a Paradox game. It's got some very good mechanics already in. Of course, it's still very bare bones, which you do notice as the game progresses into the later years. But but modders will improve the system. Workshop will of course improve issues I have with the game, and of course more DLC and expansion will make it better. If anyone who is a veteran of Paradox knows, a lot of the early releases have got quite basic for the base game, such as Hearts of Iron 4, which had oil which you used to produce tanks when the first game came out, and of course since then that's developed into something more complex. As it stands, this is a very good baseline, some very good mechanics, and in future of some tweaks and changes and some mods, I can see it very much being a very stable game. Now, I played a bit of Victoria 2, and I did have some misgivings about Victoria 3 by looking at some of the streams and some of the more memey videos, but altogether I think it is a pretty fun, pretty unique economic simulator that can lead to some fun things developing. So without further ado, what is Victoria 3? Apologies, I've got a bit of a sore throat, gentlemen. So Victoria 3 is set in the Victorian period, so from about 1836 to 1936. It's a stopgap between EU4 and Hearts of Iron 4. In this, you play as a nation, and this acts as the spirit of the nation as you guide it through the period, through the economic revolution, political reforms, and through military and political intrigue. Most of your time will be spent trying to sort of improve your nation economically, improve the quality of life of your nation, expand your markets, and try and become a great power while limiting the power of other nations. Through this, you can you manipulate your economy, improve your industry, change your population, and go to war with your opposing nations to either limit their resources, limit their growth, or even just expand your markets. So, in short, the first thing I want to cover is the actual economy. So initially, I had some big concerns about the economy coming from Victoria 2. Victoria 2, you have a global free market where all goods are sort of traded on that market. However, you also had certain goods that were produced in certain territories or regions, such as Romania that produced oil, or say China that produced tea, or India that produced tea, and these goods were limited to geographical locations. This meant that eventually it led to conflict as nations tried to expand to meet their economical demands late game, trying to access those rare resources such as the oil and coal and so on and so forth. And this led to things such as spheres of influence, and of course those pressure points and diplomatic plays/crises that occurred in Victoria 2. Now, when I first saw the streams and the videos of Victoria 3, I was a bit unhappy with the fact that you now had global markets and that you could freely trade with other nations, just via the import or export demand. I like to say that although there are still some problems with the Victoria 3 market system, it isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. So as a brief summary of the economic system, each nation has their own market, not own Russian market. They can, of course, incorporate other nations into that market via puppeting or via customs unions, via good diplomacy. This allows you access to resources you may not have got access to before, such as opium or tea or silk, as well as gives you a domestic growth in terms of domestic products that are available to you. A good example would be Sweden. Sweden produces a lot of iron and steel, and because I now have that in my market, I no longer have to trade for it. That automatically goes into my domestic market because that is in my sphere of influence. This means that the game still has elements of expansion and intrigue and crises as great powers try and expand their market as opposed to their territory to other nations. That can lead to the change of the balance of power. This is a fairly good mechanic and a fairly good system because, of course, it means that there's still that level of pressure between nations. For example, I don't want Russia to take Persia or Sweden because that means I would have to trade to, say, Prussia for the steel from Russia instead of Sweden, because now Sweden is part of the market. Now, Russia could then embargo me or limit that production of steel or use that steel itself, depriving me of that access, meaning that you still have those pressure points even with the sort of free trade system you currently have in place. However, the cons, I would say, of this system is the ample supply of basic resources. Even playing as a minor nation, because every nation has access to, say, grain or coal or iron or steel, because it's so abundant, it means there is less resource warfare or less conflict over resources. It's not really until the late game when things such as rubber and oil make the scene does it become harder to access those resources, and by that stage you don't really have to rely on it. You can use other things such as like electricity and so on and so forth. An example is perhaps playing as Sweden. I can go over to Sweden building. Oh, let's go off that. And instead of trading for grain off of, say, Russia, I can just mass produce this one rye farm until it's like level 60. And then that means that feeds my grain supply. That means there's it's quite a bad thing, I think, because it means there's less dependency on the economies of other nations. That means there's less conflict and less room for the economic exploitation or economic warfare that, of course, you'd think a game such as Victoria 3 would have. This, of course, will be easily fixed in time with modders, perhaps changing the access to resources so only certain locations have access to that grain, or limiting the level a grain farm can go to, or limiting the extent of its production. But as it stands, as a minor nation, you can mass produce a resource you probably really shouldn't be able to, simply by investing to the max level of that industry in your own territory. So right now there's not really that much of a resource shortage. There's only a few resources on the market, such as opium, tea, silk, dye, and rubber, that are really quite rare, and oil that are really quite rare and hard to get hold of. Everything else is an ample supply. So this means the way you can economically manipulate other nations is a lot harder. Now, the AI is quite intelligent in this game in that it will trade for resources in the short term while then building up its industry in the long term. So if I was Russia and became a grain magnet and became the world's best producer of grain, I couldn't really force starvation or drought on Austria or France, because although they would trade with me in the short term, in the long term they would build up their own grain supplies, which they are capable of doing themselves. So although it does lead to room for economic sort of intrigue, crises and so on and so forth, the current base system in which there's such a free access to resources in most nations, with the exception of being a few minor ones such as Afghanistan and really tiny nations that aren't in a market, such as some of the German states, there is still a limited level of economic warfare. Because the AI is not stupid, it won't just become completely dependent on you for grain or tools or so on and so forth. It will have its own domestic supply. So at best, you can, in the short term, dent their growth, but you're not going to be able to stop it completely. However, as a system itself, it is still an extremely good system, because it does leave room for improvement. And with the modding community and workshops and potential as patches, I can see the game slowly changing the ample supply of resources so that you do lead to that sort of resource warfare and lead to some nations becoming, say, hegemony of grain, or other nations become a hegemony on on specialized products. And then, of course, you can have a greater likelihood of conflict between each state and each great power. The economic market system itself is a complex system, an interesting system, and a good system, but it's let down right now by the ample amount of resources the world has. And even at late game, I did not really see any issues getting hold of goods I needed. I could produce, even as Sweden, I could produce as much tools as I needed, and as much grain as I wanted to support my domestic product population without having to export or import it. That was just done more out of convenience rather than necessity. And so, although the market system has its use for getting more specialist resources in the late game, in the early game, your basic resources most nations can get by themselves. And that means, of course, there is a limited scope for political intrigue. It means the AI is, of course, better and easier at growing, but it also means that the system itself has a less of an impact. And so if you were to embargo a nation, you're not really going to, in most nations, you're not really going to see a massive impact because most nations are smart enough to build up their own domestic industry. It's more the short-term impact that you will have. Equally, the market system is still good in terms of that it gives you access to other nations that will also bolster your own product and allow you to trade with their rare resources while also them trading with your ample resources. It's also quite a complex system in whether or not as a minor nation you want to join the customs union, because a minor nation that has a specialized product will of course want to join a customs union, but a minor nation such as Sweden that has a more general industry will not, because they may get inundated with cheaper products which will destroy the domestic industry. So it has a lot of benefits, the economic system, and the way you go about trading and expanding your markets is very interesting. Instead of just painting the map green territorially, you're painting the map green or blue or grey in terms of customs unions and markets. It still has some minor oversights and minor issues that need to be improved. When it comes to, say, the actual population and politics of the game, I found it was also a very interesting system and also very complex and rewarding. So, of course, with our politics, you have certain governments, and each nation will have their own government, which will have their own parties that support and oppose certain policies. And of course, part of the game is balancing the needs of your nation to reform, or balancing the wants of your big power stakeholders in your country. And that means potentially running the risk of turmoil and civil war, or potentially gradually changing the political clout of each party to it suits your needs, which happens organically as the population changes from a more rural conservative population to a more industrial liberal nation, which is a very interesting and fun mechanic which allows you to, of course, play around with the limitations of your country and try and sort of influence your parties. It's not just a case of press one button to abolish serfdom, it's influence parties a certain way to support serfdom so you can get it through and pass it without causing turmoil and making your political parties unhappy. Because if you make your political parties unhappy and they are a large stakeholder, it may lead to large-scale turmoil, economic decline, and potential civil war. That's a really interesting and fun mechanic, and I like the idea of that. Coupled with things such as the mana criticism a lot of like Imperator Rome had and other Paradox games has, I do like to think that they have made less abstract, made the power, sort of the mana you have in this game less abstract. All the points you get has a direct correlation to what you create. So bureaucracy comes from government buildings which need paper, and therefore it doesn't pop out of thin air. You've got to increase your bureaucracy by increasing your government spending in your government industries. Authority, you get more by changing laws and changing the wealth and popularity. And so again, this is not just an abstract concept. You can directly affect this. Political influence you get by research, which, although it is more of an abstract concept, still isn't the end of the world. And of course, your GDP is not very abstract as well. You can see here, I've changed my GDP to mass expenditure or mass taxation here. And so that's why you see that massive rise. And of course, the GDP is affected on taxation, tariffs, and so on and so forth. And so the mana system that other Paradox games were heavily criticized for is less abstract in Victoria 3, and that makes the game a bit more realistic and a bit more, immersive than what you potentially ran the risk of running into. And of course, you've got things such as our population. So population of Victoria 3 is very interesting and very complex. So populations have different stratas, upper, middle, and lower, and they have different professions in each strata. Now, each population will do certain jobs, and they will also require certain qualifications to do certain jobs, and they have a required standard of living. Their standard of living comes from whether or not they can afford certain necessary products to live. So for the lower strata, it might be grain or basic clothing, whereas for the upper strata, it might be fine clothes or tea. And of course, as the game progresses, the minimum expectations of those populations change and become, of course, higher, leading to that constant race to sort of improve the standard of living and develop your nation, which of course is not extrapolated, it's dependent on what you produce and the prices of your products on the market. This is, again, is a very complex and interesting system, and I like the way you can manipulate this. So, for example, if I want to improve the quality of life for the lower strata, I can, of course, mass produce grain and mass produce clothing, but this will of course reduce the price of clothing and grain in my country, and this means that I will either have to subsidize those industries or I will have to export the surplus grain. Or now I suspect I would have to subsidize those industries, and in that way I continue to lower the price of grain, making the quality of life or the standard of living of that lower strata better. Of course, I need to build grain farms, and I need to build groceries and food industries first. And so again, all of these sort of complex interactions between the economy, the standard of living, and your industry all go hand in hand. You can't just lower prices and hope the standard of living improves. You need to lower prices, build products that meet the demand, or import or export those products, which I found really interesting. Again, population was also quite an interesting mechanic, of course, with population rising, with the standard of living improving, and migration through certain laws and legislation. Of course, you've also got things such as radicals and loyalists, and again, a very complex system which some people may struggle to understand. And of course, it comes down to the quality of life for a lot of the populations in each region. So if certain populations aren't getting their demands or not making a living, they may become radical. If those populations are part of a political party that is unhappy with you, that may also cause more radicalization, leading to turmoil and civil war. So it adds another layer of complexity to the game, which I find really interesting. Of course, at the start, it's extremely confusing to understand why these radicals are kicking off. And so, but eventually, once you understand the game, you understand the balance between growth, industry, or your population demands, and your political parties. It all sort of comes seamlessly together to make a really interesting concept. And then, of course, you've got loyalists, which are, of course, the adverse, parties that support you will increase loyalists, and, of course, the standard of living improves. There are some problems with this generalized system. One of the big problems is this gives you the national standard of living and the national radicalization, but of course each state will have their own needs and wants. So standard of living is the average standard of living in Russia, but there may be some states that do not have that standard of living, and so it can lead to sometimes some confusion, thinking, why have I got this turmoil even though the standard of living is so high? And it's the odds are you have this standard of turmoil simply because in that state they have a lower standard of living than expected, or they're losing too much money through taxation. Now, the rest of the country may have a good standard of living, but that state, because of a lack of jobs, or because of the taxation, or because of the price of goods, is in turmoil, or because of their political party is unhappy, is in turmoil. So sometimes it can be quite confusing to understand how population impacts or why your country is behaving a certain way. But with experience and understanding, you can eventually learn why and try and fix it. I have had issues sometimes with death spirals or turmoil death spirals, where a population is too low, it's not getting the resources it needs, and so it ends up with turmoil. Then you try and build market access and build jobs, but there's not enough pop there anymore to improve the market access and do those jobs, and so there's more turmoil, so more people leave, and you end up in a ghost state. A good example of this is Russian cars. where the population is now going up, but before it had like 57% turmoil. I pretty much subsidized all the industry. I built as many factories as possible. I built as many farms as possible. I built as much railway as possible, but they simply weren't enough people anymore to do the jobs. In the end, I had to subsidize the railways. But although E-system is quite complex, and that makes it quite enjoyable. So once you understand it, you can influence it and manipulate it the way you see fit. However, when you first start the game, it can take you quite aback, and the tutorial the game gives you of Sweden that is just too much busy click work. In the end, I would just recommend you just play it straight away, learn from your mistakes, and go from there. So the population also comes down to demographics of different cultures, and there we are. And different laws will see how cultures are treated, and if cultures are discriminated against, they may not get the benefits of, say, welfare or institutions. They also may be more likely to have turmoil and things like that. And again, this is a very complex and quite amusing system where you can see how the economic simulation changes and how your nation demographic changes because of either how successful you are or how unsuccessful you are. So you can see here with my population, we have got some Ibo population, which is about 1.46 million, some Afro-Caribbean, which is 1.8 million, and some Irish, that is 2.24 million, 63 million Ukrainians, and 180 million Russians, and that's been caused by migration. And so the game does lead to some meme-worthy events, like half your population perhaps being like, I don't know, like Aboriginal or Afro-Caribbean if you're a small country and you game it that way. But it can be funny and it can be understandable from the way the game works. You can manipulate the game in such a way to lead to those funny moments. And it can be quite interesting after, say, a playthrough to look at how your nation's demographics change because of how successful you are. Of course, you're less successful, your demographic won't change that much because of emigration. But of course, if you're successful, then you start to realize, I see why this has happened. And so the population, again, a very interesting and fun mechanic. Again, the only thing I would say is that it's complex. That's the only thing I will say. It's complex enough that it takes a while for you to understand it, but after a while you do realize what's going on, and then of course it makes life less frustrating through trial and error. With the warfare, it was of course a step down from Hearts of Iron 4 and so on and so forth. Now, we all like to talk about Victoria 2's warfare, but it was nothing that spectacular. It was simply improve your nation enough to have large amounts of troops available due to increased population. Make sure they have the best tech. If you want to game it, make a load of conscripts with cannons, and then micromanage to death those massive stacks of troops. Now, it was a bit tedious and a bit time consuming, and yes, you had the micro aspect of it. It wasn't everything it's cracked up to be. Yes, they have simplified the system in Victoria 3. It is a lot more basic. I won't say otherwise. You simply select your troops or build barracks in a certain HQ, promote generals, and send them to defend or hold a front. And if you want to upgrade your military, then you go to development and change what sort of warfare they fight or sort of what level they are. Which you get by research, and then you fight the war. What is interesting is not the war itself really, but the economic impact of those wars. So one example is when I was fighting Austria, because I took the North German Federation, they had better tech troops than myself. So I went to defensive and held the line with my large amounts of troops, which I got from my massive population. Now, even though they could win each battle very easily, because I was playing defensive, it took them a very long time to do so. And because they were trading or importing so much material from me, they were taking more economic damage from fighting the war than I was from defending it. So even though militarily they would have won, economically they were losing too badly, and in the end they called for a white peace that allowed me to keep the North German Federation. So even though the warfare is more simplistic, when it's tied in relation to the greater economic nature of the game and the greater sort of economic influence that it has on your warfare and your fighting and your ability to wage war, it can become more interesting, and it can become the thing I would say in Victoria 2, the way wars were fought So you fought like, you know, big blobs early on with big stacks, but not across the entire front. But as the game progressed, you ended up with massive defensive lines. You can still see that to an extent in Victoria 3, but with the large amounts of troops by a number going on to those fronts and the greater impact economically it's having. Whereas before, if you were smaller and less developed, you'd have smaller numbers, whereas, of course, later game, you'd have larger numbers and be able to sustain them. Yes, it's not as interesting. Yes, it's not as immersive as the Victoria 2 system, but it's still a good representation of the economic impact of warfare, and it's still enough for you to go, to smile to yourself when you see your opponent collapse economically because you just had too many more troops, or because they couldn't afford the war which you could. And wars late game do become massive sort of slogs along the fronts. Like when I was fighting Austria, the war was just a gradual push in these sectors, with like one battle occurring every couple of months with large amounts of casualties. And so you still have that slow trench warfare late game, but it's just less hands-on. Of course, I suspect updates will improve it, but I don't think they'll be able to change it to micro units. I don't think it's really that good. Yes, it's different. Yes, it's less hands-on, but I don't think it's as bad as what people think or people say it is. I mean, yes, it could be better. It could be like Hoi 4 level with like front lines and so on and so forth. But as it stands, it's more economics is warfare is an extension of the economic system, and war and you can fill the wars by looking at your economy and looking at your pops, and it still gives you that warm fuzzy feeling knowing that you've become a massive powerhouse that can field massive amounts of troops without facing a dent to your economy, while your enemy's economy just collapses, and you can smile to yourself as you watch the enemy's GDP collapses as you move into their territory. I mean, there are good points and bad points from it. So yes, it's more shallow, yes, it's more hands-off, but it's still quite rewarding to see the impacts that war has on the economic theatre. Navy is also the same, but there's a bit more micromanagement. So again, you just upgrade your buildings and select new navies, which of course you need to produce and so on and so forth. But it's a bit more micro because you've got to defend your convoys, which can be more convoy rated. Now, I think the Navy is something that's being sort of underlooked by a lot of reviewers, and the Navy system and the naval warfare and economic warfare from Navy is actually pretty impressive and pretty fun and pretty... you can have a lot of impact on that. So if I'm playing, say, Great Britain, and I know as Russia is using, say, 33,000 convoys, I can convoy raid to my heart's content and watch Russia's imports and their economy start to struggle to a halt. Then, of course, at least other nations building up their navies and their naval battles, which again are still pretty hands-off, but allows you to do certain techniques such as defending convoys, raiding convoys, and naval invasions. And so again, it's still more hands-off and easier to macro without that rewarding factor of maneuvering massive hordes of troops, but at the same time, you can still feel you're having a direct impact on your enemy's economy and your enemy's nation by looking at their GDP and their standard of living. And so although really, I would say the military system is more an extension of the economic system, and and it's designed to reflect the economic nature. Really, warfare is more about economics in this game rather than micro and outskilling the enemy. Which is really quite... It's a different take on the warfare model. I don't think... Of course, we could go for the Hoi 4 model, and everyone would love it, but I don't think it's as bad as people say. I mean, it's the Victoria 2 was okay. It wasn't as good as people make it out. Like, if you left a part of the line open, you just watched the enemy march through, and if everyone remembers bloody clicking on every single state to make forts, it's not as good as everyone loves. But it's a new system. It's a system that isn't about, it's isn't a Hoi 4 warfare for warfare's sake system. It's a system which is about economics and the impacts wars have on the economics. The AI itself is pretty good and can raise some effective troop numbers. In fact, for a large period of time, I had to build up my military industry because Austria had such a large army. It's now sort of collapsed again because it's through economic hardship. But because of the simplicity of the game, it does allow the AI to be a bit more of a challenge to you when it comes to military. because of course all they have to do is move troops to a line, and so you are going to feel more of a challenge and be a bit more scared of the enemy if they decide to declare war on you. So it's a step back on what, in regards to micromanagement and microing large-scale armies. A step forward by having it reflect the economic situation and being able to directly influence enemies' economies via warfare. It's both a more simplistic system, but also a more complex system. It's different. I know people won't like it. People want it developed. I don't think they're going to be able to develop to a Hearts of Iron 4 micromanagement level because of the simple requirements for everything it would take. I've had a few bugs, such as warm province regions. So if a unit is having a civil war, you will see that they won't have, like a small nation, they won't have enough troops either side to actually win the war, and so it's a never-ending war as a bug. But as a whole, it's not as bad as people make out. I mean, it's simple, but it's not as bad as people make out. It really is not a war game. If you're looking for micromanagement warfare, it's not. Really, you're fighting wars through the economic model. Then, of course, so we've talked about POPs, we've talked about the economy, we've talked about... I think I'll go back to the economy just a little bit because, of course, another complex system is, of course, the ability to trade and import goods and so on and so forth, which again does add the extra layer. But as I was referring to earlier, there's no, apart from embargoing, even then embargoes don't have as great as impact as you hope they would have. Because if you did embargo a nation, the odds are the AI is smart enough to have a generalized, widespread economy and they will quickly make up the shortfall. It's more just for long-term slowing down of growth. I do like the new system with the ability to import and export as well. However, I think if you wanted a more, how do I put it, a more room for conflict or a greater room for warfare or a greater room for crises and political plays, they should perhaps remove the ability to manually import and export goods from other nations. They should perhaps keep the trade agreement system. So if you do a trade agreement, you can import and export, but as a default, they should not have that put in, because at default it means that it means that the AI can completely ignore the economic realities or political realities, and it means the political sphere and the political system and the quest for markets is less impactful. Yeah, so I would change that a little bit. So instead of being able to trade with anyone freely, instead I would have to get a trade agreement first, and then I could do that system up here. If I didn't get the trade agreement first, then of course I wouldn't be able to do it. But I can see why they did it. It just seems that it just means that it ends up becoming, instead of a game of economic warfare and economic conflict and growth and struggle, it ends up becoming a bit easier. And sometimes it feels like it becomes a bit of a hug box as every nation is freely trades between one another, which is further exaggerated and emphasized by the resource system, of course, but because of how ample resources are. A good example would be, say, if we change the system, if I have Austria, I'd have the Austrian market, and then I wouldn't have access to tea and silk and all that stuff. And I'd have limited grain supply, and so then I'd increase relations with Russia, and then I get a trade agreement, and then I would get that grain off them. Whereas it stands, if I was playing as Austria, I would just go buy grain, click, which is currently a tad too easy, and it means there's less room for economic strife and economic conflict between larger great powers. So let's talk about politics. So the political system really is just about quest for markets. Of course, you can annex stuff and form and colonize and all that sort of stuff. But generally speaking, you are doing political actions to expand your markets, to increase your GDP, to make your pops happy and access new resources. Instead of painting the map normally by a conquest, you're painting the map through the trade lens. Now there's multiple ways of doing that. One way is, of course, improving relations and inviting nations into a customs union. Another way is, of course, by puppeting and creating puppet states and dominions. Now there's also things such as the spheres of influence, which you can create, which allows you to have be able to do diplomatic plays in certain regions, which you may not normally have. Normally, you have a sphere of influence or a what do you call it, area of interest wherever you have a border. But if you don't have a border there, you need to manually put down an area of interest. This then allows for diplomatic plays. Now, I found diplomatic plays were very interesting and quite an innovative concept. One of the things I liked about it was that it did lead to me sometimes backing down because, of course, it meant that every sort of major power who had an interest in that area could join a side and stop me fighting a war, or make me fight a war, or make me acquiesce to demands. This meant that I've had to be careful a few times on my expansion, and that meant I had to take things a bit slower. So in the case of, like, say, Scandinavia, initially I wanted to puppet Scandinavia quickly, and so I first started a diplomatic play to take Scandinavia. Then, of course, Sweden, who had like 400 divisions and what was left of Prussia, moved in to support Scandinavia. They demanded part of Finland, and I made a decision to back down and give them that part. Then Prussia went to war with Austria, and I made a second diplomatic play for Scandinavia, at which stage no one joined Scandinavia, and I was able to take it. And so it's an interesting way to to lead to the balance of power, but I still feel the AI at the time is not as protective as it normally is when it should be. I was able to take Persia pretty much uncontested, and apart from Scandinavia and even Egypt to an extent, because each nation was dealing with their own problems or simply because they were too passive, they often meant that it didn't really kick off. But the fact that by backing down you end up losing territory or losing or taking penalties such as reparations and things like that, it does raise the stakes. If you do make a diplomatic play, are you willing to give up territory, or are you willing to make losses for this if it turns against you? And I think it's quite an interesting concept. And the diplomacy and the politics as itself of constantly expanding and trying to keep the balance of power is pretty interesting. In practice, there have been parts of the game where it's worked, and other parts of the game where I've taken ridiculous gains without anyone really stopping me. Although some of it is justifiable, because of course when Austria is at war with Prussia, they're not going to go to war with Russia as well. So it depends through the realm of understanding why it happens. Altogether, I don't think it's too bad, and I think it's going to be great for multiplayer games. But of course, with a bit of fine tuning and a couple of bit of modding, I suspect the AI will be much more eagle-eyed against sort of wanton expansion. In regards to the infamy system, I knew a lot of people were irritated that in some of the videos how the infamy system worked, and that nations were able to simply blob, like that Brazil one, where Brazil just blobbed all of Brazil early on. Now, the infamy system isn't as bad as Victoria 2, where the world just turns against you and tries to clap you, but it still has some big impacts. An example is that if you have a high infamy, nations that have voluntarily joined your customs union may just leave your customs union. Alternatively, other countries may embargo you, such as I had high infamy from taking Egypt. Khiva, Bukhara and Kokand left my customs union. At the same time, Austria, France, Great Britain and Greater Qing also embargoed me, which then reduced my growth and my economic growth and limited me. Yes, it still meant I had some economic growth. Yes, I meant that I could still declare war and I could still do politics. It's that no one wanted to do politics with me. And this meant an economic slowdown to my nation. Of course, it won't really stop you blobbing the map, I suspect, if you get large enough. But there are other things stopping you from blobbing the map, mostly turmoil, the economic cost, potential lowering of the standard of living, or the fact that you're going to re-micro or perhaps inundate your country with unemployed pops, or simply greater demands on your industry. And so the politics is still interesting, the infamy still is an interesting system, but people should not look at it through the lens of growing or conquest. They should look through it via the lens of the economy. Your political system is all, and the things you do when you make your diplomatic plays is for the economy. You're trying to expand your markets and access to resources. You're not just trying to paint the map. Now, you see here I painted the map. Egypt, Persia and Scandinavia are puppets. Now I've made them puppets instead of fully conquering them because of course the turmoil from those pops, the high infamy from conquering them, and because now I have those nations who are AI that will now add to my market. And so it does lead to an interesting system where instead of us having one giant blob, you have a blob of different dominions and different different sort of satellite states, which is very interesting. Of course, I can see this working extremely well in multiplayer games with the balance of power and decisions between each nation about going to war over crisis points. In single player, the AI may need to get a little bit better about being more defensive or being more proactive in the balance of power. But as a whole, as a baseline system, again, it's a very good and interesting system, and I had a lot of fun playing with it. And I've had moments in the game where was concerned, such as in Scandinavia, and I was also concerned with the embargoes once my economy started to struggle a little bit and the quality of life started to decline. There are actions the AI does, and there are mechanics in place that does mean there is generally a consequence to what you do. But if you put your economy properly, and depending on how you put your nation, the consequences of those actions may vary in terms of severity. So I would give it the political system. I still think is pretty good. It's an interesting system, a good mechanics, and it has led to some emergent gameplay. Now, let's finally talk about the AI. Well, let's penultimately talk about the AI. So I've had mixed results with the AI. Initially, the AI is extremely intelligent in the early game. It can field large armies, such as Austria. It can hold the balance and power in Europe. It can industrialize quickly and rapidly. In fact, I was struggling for quite a while trying to keep up with the economic growth of other nations. And it is intelligent enough not to become dependent on other nations for resources. For example, again, I used to export grain to Austria, but then they bought their own grain up and then they stopped trading grain with me. Or I made a load of steel and then exported steel to, say, France. They made their own steel industry and then stopped the export. The export no longer became profitable. In that way, it turns into a rather interesting game where you can't simply bully the AI through economic warfare, which I suspect is a product of the resource abundance in this game currently, and the fact that nations can freely import and export at will at the moment, meaning the AI has a lot of room to grow without having to think too hard. Equally, the military system is somewhat simplistic, so the AI is better in that regard as well. Where the AI sort of falls down with is sometimes it can be a little too passive in regards to larger conquests. I mean, to be fair, I did take Persia in like 1937, and I did take Scandinavia after a big war in Europe, and I did take Egypt again after another war in Europe. But it's still a point to note that, again, there are some it can be sometimes too passive, but that's potentially my opinion. One of the big things I did find is that late game, the AI does seem to implode. So I don't know why. Maybe because they don't reform. I suspect it's because they don't reform. But if you look in here, you can see every single state in Europe is in turmoil. It may be because they can't handle the political system properly. It may be because they didn't reform properly. The only thing that isn't in turmoil is the USA. What about Brazil? Are you in turmoil? No, it's literally just Europe that's in turmoil. It may be simply because I don't know. Maybe I've had an impact on their markets accidentally, and they're sort of struggling. But generally speaking, late game, the AI seems to just collapse in itself. Bear in mind, this is the first time I've played all the way till 1936, but after a certain period they were doing extremely well. They had extremely high standard of living, and then they imploded. I think it's to do with their government, potentially, but again, I wouldn't be able to show because I can't really see more details about their government. But that seems to be a problem. Like early to mid game, it's quite an interesting system. There's a lot of plays, but when you get to the late game of Victoria 3, there's really not a lot to do because there's so much resources abundance. You're no longer sort of squabbling over what's left. You're just simply trading with other nations. You've sort of resigned yourself to knowing I can't expand any further. Fine, I'll just buy silk off of Great Britain. Fine, I'll just buy opium off of Great Britain. Fine, I'll just buy Tours off France. Or I'll just buy all of Russia. That you never really get to the same level in Victoria 2. Victoria 2, with a limited amount of resources and the geographical location of those resources, did mean that eventually, once you got to the late game, there would be massive wars to get hold of those resources or over the smallest territories or puppet states. Whereas in this game, when you get to the late game, there really isn't a lot to do, because at that stage you're simply just keeping down turmoil in your own states and waiting and watching the green line go up. Which is it's a bit of a step back, and it is a bit of a disappointment. Maybe it's just this game. Maybe I did something to the AI that broke it after a couple of wars, or maybe a couple of embargoes. But for the early to mid game is fun because you're still moving around, you're still trying to get markets. I just think it could be better, and the only thing they really have to change on that is where resources are, how the AI acts to protecting those resources and making sure those resources stay neutral, and changing the market system so it's not just one great big free market, right, which it is right now, but more of you have to request to access that market first before you can access it. Meaning that if I want to, I can simply decline access to my market from, say, France or Austria or so on and so forth. Again, these are simple things that can be fixed by modding, by simple modding, or by simple patches, but it's still a point to note. As opposed to why the nations collapsed, I have absolutely no idea. But I think it may come down to the lack of reforms those nations have done, as well as potentially how each nation deals with their government. Now you can see these nations are death spiraling. That's one point I did notice. There was a risk of death spiraling if you did get high turmoil, which again you could just about fix in most cases, but sometimes you couldn't, and you just ended up with ghost provinces. What else? And I started to suffer a lot of turmoil myself, and the late game ends up becoming, can you survive impending revolution, which is fun, but it's not to the same level of Victoria 2, where you had massive final wars of economic dominance. I didn't have a massive. After 1900, I was pretty much peaceful, and I think I ended up eating the North German Federation, having a war of Austria around about 1890 with Germany, because I could. It was open and I could take it because they had like no brigades. And I think they ended up giving up because there was no hope of, and they didn't even fight a war. But there's some little things they need to fix and improve. Late game, they do need to add more or change the way the game works right now to make the late game more responsive. Again, I feel like you can have a great time in multiplayer because you can do more to restrict other people's access to markets. But the thing I struggled with, it was just like, even if I did embargo Austria, it normally was intelligent enough to have its own industry to ignore my embargo, or it just trade with other powers. And so right now I think there needs to be some changes to how the AI acts to larger powers trying to access their markets, as well as the actual abundance to supply and how trade is done between larger powers, which are easy fixes and which can be finally sort of dealt with. Finally, the thing I'll discuss is the UI. So the one thing I will say about the UI is it's obtuse. There's a lot of ways. There's 2 or 3 ways of doing the same thing. So of course, if I want to build a rye farm, I can just select this and build a rye farm. Alternatively, I can go to my buildings and select a rye farm, or by going over here, or wheat farm, clicking this and selecting that. Alternatively, I can go over to, say, Moscow and go down to buildings and select livestock farm and rye farms. And because there's so many ways to do it, you can quickly end up doing the least optimum way. So as Russia, initially I was going from every single state and going build, 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 when in fact all I had to do was go down here, or I had to go down here. Also, sometimes a lot early on it was quite difficult to understand what my pops needed, because the UI is sometimes a bit too obtuse and too for example, I'd know that my quality of life for my lower strata was too bad, but I didn't know what my lower strata needed. So then I was like, okay, well, what do I go to find out which pops needed it? Okay, I had to go here, and then finally I had to find this number here, which was a pain in the ass to find. It took me like 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And then it's like, okay, what do I need to do next? Okay, so how do I change that? I need to produce grain. Why are my factories not producing anything? I don't know why. Do I manually check each factory, or do I go over here, scroll down and find why they're not producing things? Or do I just go over and check this instead and then trade? And eventually, over time, you do find the most optimum way of doing things, the easier way of doing things. But at the start, it can be very obtuse and lead to a lot of clicking. But this is something you learn with experience. In short, or in summary, I think Victoria 3 is a good baseline. I know there'll be a lot of the old guard that say Victoria 2 was better, and yes, Victoria 2 did have its merits, but of course it is through rose-glinted spectacles. There are a lot of bad things from Victoria 2 as well. Victoria 3 takes some of the general themes from Victoria 2 and improves in some areas and simplifies in others, but altogether makes a very interesting and complex base system, which once you understand it can become a bit eye-rolling, a bit boring as the game progresses when it gets to the late game, but early on it's quite fun and interesting to see where your nation is going and how your nation is reacting to external stimuli. However, there are some glaring oversights, such as the economic system being a bit too easy to free trade, leading to a reduced sort of political intrigue, a reduced political friction in single player because of the abundance of resources, but this can be quickly fixed. Warfare is more simplistic, but also more interesting and more complex on its economic impact it has on the world. And also the pop system is still wonderfully fun and interesting to look at. Again, obtuse when you first get into it, but very fun to look at and to manipulate. I also find the government system very fun and very dynamic and organic. Altogether, it's a very healthy baseline. As Paradox releases go, it's a healthy baseline and it's functional. Like a lot of Paradox games aren't functional release. This game is functional. I know the old guard will say it's not functional, but for a Paradox game, it's pretty functional. I mean, Victoria 2 wasn't functional. Hearts of Iron 4 is barely functional with Brain Dead AI. It has improved, and I think this is a good progress. I'll be playing a multiplayer game on a weekend. I think I'll do some basic recording of that, but I think this game will be great for multiplayer as well. As long as it's stable, touch wood, because you're going to have a greater impact on other people's economies, and people's economies are going to be less generalized. And so, for example, if Austria becomes specialist, they may become more dependent, whereas the AI will become more generalist. A player may become more specialist and become more vulnerable to the economic systems. But altogether, I think it's a good baseline. I think modders and workshops will improve this current system we currently have and make it better and make it more realistic and make it more immersive. And I think as expansions and DLC is added to the game, it will also lead to a very marked improvement. And I suspect it will lead to the same standard as essentially Hearts of Iron 4. A wonderful, interesting game. And not disappointing in the slightest. Just late game, it gets boring. They need more stuff for the late game, and that just needs to be, and that can be just influenced by a change in the market system. It's a good base. I would recommend if you want. You're never going to get a bells on whistle Paradox game anyway. You're just going to have to mod the hell out of it, and there's still even big bugs in Hoi 4 and so on and so forth. But if you want a economic grand strategy game that is interesting and complex enough to keep you occupied for quite a long period of time, and has promise of developing and has a promise for modders to make the game unique and different for you the longer the game continues, then I would recommend getting it. If you want a game that is for all about the economy and population and law and culture in a time period that's about liberalization, I would recommend you get it. If you want a game that is about warfare and micromanaging troops, I recommend you don't get it. If you want a game that is about painting the map, I recommend you don't get it. If you want a game that is completely fleshed out and even more complex, so you need a big Bible to read it, and you need like a 300-page how-to, I recommend you don't get it. It is the right level of complexity for multiplayer games. It's the right level of complexity as it stands for newer players to get into it. And as the game progresses, I can only see the game getting more complex, more improved, more streamlined, and more interesting. I would recommend as a solid 7 out of 10. A 7 out of 10 for a Paradox game. Probably because I see the multiplayer potential in it as well. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Because it has bugs, it has glaring oversights. Once you do get to the late game, it does get tedious. Colonialism is literally make a point of interest and send a colony over there. And the economic model, although complex, does let you down towards the late game as well. But this can be quickly fixed. So, in short, I'm not that disappointed. I know other people who are, but I think it's pretty good. Thank you very much for watching, gentlemen, and I hope you have a good one. Adieu.